Hello everybody and welcome to Real Opinions, and this is the first part in a new feature that I'm going to be doing in the lead up to Halloween. So each one of these the entries in this series is a different recommendation of a horror game. So I'm going to be going through different styles, different genres, different periods, and I'm going to be recommending different games to suit different types of players, be it casual gamers, psychological horror fans, or gore hounds. No matter who you are, there should be a game in this series that appeals to you that I think is a great game to get in the Halloween spirit. You might notice that the games in this series tend to get good ratings from me. There are two reasons for this. Number one, I'm partial to the horror genre, so it happens to be my favourite. So I'm going to be a little bit kind to the games that actually fit into that bracket. And number two, this is a feature of games that I would recommend, therefore they're bound to be scored highly. So subscribe and look forward to the future installments in here, because there's going to be something that will appeal to you. Okay, the first game in this series is the notoriously grisly indie shocker Outlast. Since its release in 2013, Red Barrel Studios' notoriously nasty Outlast has drawn in a fairly wide range of reactions, some of which have been incredibly positive, some have been lukewarm, and some have been incredibly negative. It's definitely garnered its fair share of critics over time, with certain detractors citing everything from the game's perceived over-reliance on jump scares to the repetitive nature of the gameplay and the level design. The situation has only worsened in the brief space of a few years, as the ever-growing herd of imitators and wannabes attempting to ride on this game's coattails have soured the original's reputation, turning it into a very easy target for people who hate jump scares and hate all these things that have become so generic within horror games now. In fact, it's quite difficult to play Outlast with fresh eyes now, as everything about it has already become commonplace at best and utterly trite at worst. From the abandoned asylum setting to the hide-and-seek stealth mechanics to the battery hunting gameplay loop, it basically ticks every Steam horror game cliche that there is. Hell, even AAA titles have begun to appropriate aspects of this same approach, which you can see with Alien Isolation or The Evil Within. Just take this formula and do it on a bigger scale. But it's still worth remembering that Outlast was among the pioneers of this stealth horror hybrid genre, and that even after being so mercilessly ripped off, and some of these rip-offs are very blatant, it still manages to distinguish itself by simply being the best at what it does, even if what it does isn't very nice. Despite losing some of its uniqueness over time, Outlast remains among the most shocking, disturbing, and fun experiences that you can have with a horror game, thanks to its extremely gory imagery and unrelenting intensity. The game has you take control of Miles Upshaw, an investigative reporter who has received a mysterious tip about human rights abuses and all kinds of shady activity occurring at Mount Massive Asylum. Armed with only a camcorder and some inexplicable parkour skills, Upshaw infiltrates the hospital and gets to work documenting what he can find. It soon becomes apparent that things have gone well and truly to hell at Mount Massive, as Miles discovers the dead bodies of the security team scattered around the place, as well as a staggering amount of blood and guts. Worse still, he quickly becomes acquainted with the resident variants, these deformed, highly psychotic patients who are now roaming free, eager to satiate their various unsavory desires. As Miles, you must run, sneak. Much like in a nightmare, you will lurch from horrific encounter to a horrific encounter with no clear indication of if and when it will finally relent. In gameplay terms, this scenario is mainly played out in a series of stalking sequences and hide to avoid a host of necrophiliacs, crazed surgeons, and a hulking giant with a liking for self-mutilation and tearing people's heads from their bodies, in which you can use stealthy tactics to evade your pursuers. Said tactics range from hiding under beds and in lockers to flat out sprinting like a madman in the other direction. Whilst Alien Isolation may have subsequently refined these simple mechanics, Outlast still has enough meat on its bones to make work as a thrilling game of cat and mouse. What keeps this horror gem feeling fresh, however, is the ingenious camcorder gimmick at its core. The found footage aesthetic may have grown stale in cinema a long time ago, but for a game it's still a fairly fresh perspective, one that gives Outlast a very idiosyncratic flavour. On one hand, it serves as your basic flashlight device, which is by the numbers standard obligatory component in a horror game. But the difference here is it's a camera, which uses the night vision component, allowing you to see in the pitch black darkness, this being the one handicap that you have over the killers, the one thing that gives you a slight edge. It's a neat way of innovating on the simple act of lighting, but the grainy jade filter also gives everything a much more realistic and unnerving visual style. I can't explain it, but it makes everything feel more raw and gritty and grimy. Moreover, you can use the camera for for its zoom capabilities, giving you another advantage in terms of exploring the areas and scouting ahead. Last but not least, the camera also has the ability to record certain key narrative events, giving you access to the narrator's internal monologue during these moments. It might sound like a minor addition on paper, but honestly, the camcorder is a core feature that comes to define your time skulking around the dark corridors of Mount Massive. And like I said, found footage might be old and boring in cinema, but here it's actually, in some ways, I think it works better. But the question of originality isn't really the major controversy surrounding Outlast now. The problem that really separates the diehard fans from the skeptics is far harder to evaluate on objective terms. You see, the question when it ultimately comes down to is there anything actually scary about Outlast, or is it wholly comprised of manipulative adjustments in volume designed only to startle? Well, honestly, it's a little from column A and a little from column B. Yes, there's a bounty of jump scares here, and after a while you start to become a little desensitized to them. They do at least make an effort to misdirect you with some of the scares, where they heavily telegraph a jump scare in one place and then it happens somewhere else entirely different. But it's no denying that a lot of the suspense in this game comes from wanting to avoid the next abrupt jolt that you have no way of predicting. This may be off-putting to some, but it is worth keeping in mind that there is a difference between a good jump scare and a tacky one, which is something that I think Outlast is mindful of. There's also a difference between something featuring jump scares and a game featuring only jump scares. This is a distinction that I have to make a lot when we're reviewing horror films, when me and Ben are arguing over whether a film was scary or not. There is a difference between something having jump scares, having a lot of jump scares, and something only having jump scares. And I think that Outlast falls more towards the artful side of the spectrum here, as there's a wide variety of frights on display, from properly revolting gore, to terrifying sound design, to seriously disturbing characters. This throws everything in the kitchen sink at you. Are you claustrophobic? Outlast has you covered. Squeamish? Oh boy, does it have you covered in that respect. Are you afraid of the dark? What about ghosts? This game has both. It's like the airplane of horror. It just keeps throwing things at you, hoping something will stick, but it works. Something's bound to land because it's just throwing scares at you all the time. Different varieties. And just like with Airplane, it's successful. I think the game especially excels in the characterization department, depicting all kinds of colourful crazies that stick around in your mind until long after you put the controller down. It's the game's greatest strength, really, is the characters. It avoids generic villains in favour of much more imaginative antagonists. There's Chris Walker, the noseless, lipless brute who has appointed himself the role of the asylum bouncer. He's a pretty physically imposing presence, and his visual design is exquisite. There's also Dr. Traeger, potentially my favourite from the game. He's a former business executive who has delusions of being an experimental surgeon, and he's concerned with like these questions of whether people need various organs in order to survive. He's also got a really friendly demeanour and acts curiously sane in conversation with you, except, you know, when he's performing his operations. But like when he's chasing you down, he sounds hurt that you left him. He sounds like genuinely wounded that you don't want to be around him. Then there's Eddie Gluskin, or the Groom as he's ominously referred to, who is without a doubt the standout character from the game's Whistleblower DLC. Now Gluskin is largely shrouded in mystery until he makes his memorable debut, so skip ahead to avoid any spoilers, but be warned, this guy is truly messed up. Hinted at early on via a creepy little rhyme reminiscent of a Freddy Krueger song. You know, the playground song that the kids sing about Freddy Krueger is like that. It's like a nursery rhyme about the Groom. This is a nut job that the other variants in the asylum are afraid of. He's compelled to find a suitable wife, but he lives within the male ward of the asylum. And so what he does is he just makes do with whoever he gets, regardless of gender. It doesn't matter to the Groom, because with a few snips and cuts he can make a wife out of anyone, and the DLC does not shy away from showing you this procedure, leading to one of the few times I've genuinely flinched in a video game. And his madness doesn't stop there. He expects you to be grateful for the attention he's paying you, and he pursues you as if he was like a chivalrous lover, courting his intended. He has like this classic, like, honey, I'm home kind of language, and combines it with these really gross declarations of love and lust, and it's sort of, it's a really weird mixture of terrifying and blackly comedic. And then he keeps saying he wants to spread his seed in the hole that he's made, and it's the grossest thing. And for anyone who thinks that Outlast is nothing but jump scares, this particular sequence should make them reevaluate their assessment, because it's truly unsettling and disturbing, and it's way too graphic. Being chased by this lunatic through this sickening workshop is one of the most unpleasant and unbearable experiences I've ever had with a game. It's really great. I don't know how you can reduce a game to just jump scares when so many scarring images like that have been seared into my brain. I remember the time I saw a patient violating a corpse in the dark. I remember seeing Chris Walker tear a man apart with his bare hands. I remember Traeger's DIY surgery, and I'll never, ever forget the time with the groom. When I think of something that uses jump scares lazily in place of horror, I think of Five Nights at Freddy's or the Fear games. I don't think of Outlast. Outlast has something those games don't. It has a disturbed sensibility, a grimy, uncomfortable, and ultimately oppressive atmosphere, one that's kind of reminiscent of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It has characters that are interesting and compelling. It pushes the boundaries of taste as far as they can go before something becomes crass. This is a game in which you'll see copious amounts of every bodily fluid imaginable. Trust me, you'll enjoy genital mutilation, torture, and so much more. It's a game that really wants to disturb you, and it makes a considerable effort to do so. There are a couple of areas where this effort doesn't shine through, however. Firstly, the AI is beyond stupid at times, and it detracts severely from the horror when their weaknesses are so easily exploitable. Because of this, the game struggles to sustain its intense atmosphere forever, as you begin to learn the limitations of your pursuers and start to form go-to strategies that rarely fail. In particular, you'll notice that most situations can be overcome simply by bypassing stealth altogether in favor of just running straight for the exit. In particular, you'll notice that most situations can be overcome simply by bypassing stealth altogether and running straight for the exit. This might seem like a nitpick, but honestly, it's very damaging to the horror of the overall experience, because after a while, you stop being frightened and just decide to run. Secondly, the ending is pretty damn terrible. Not only does the tone and content of the climax wildly diverge from the rest of the game, but there's also a frustrating attempt to provide a scientific explanation to what you assume are supernatural events. And honestly, I think it makes it less believable, because the science employed is so, ridiculous and almost sci-fi channel quality. I'd rather just be asked to believe in ghosts than get this really crummy pseudoscience, and it really undermines the threat of the unknown spiritual force when characters try to explain it in rational terms. Finally, there's the actual issue of the conclusion itself, the very, very end. Horror films can easily get away with abrupt and unceremonious endings, like the Blair Witch Project or The Descent, because we're only invested for a couple of hours. However, with a game it's much different. With a game, the audience will sink much more time into the narrative and will actively have to fight against the game itself in order to reach a resolution, so it needs to be worth it. If that resolution proves to be unsatisfactory, then the audience has every right to be pissed. In short, game developers need to approach sudden endings with much more trepidation than filmmakers do, lest they risk the ire of dedicated players who've made it this far. Outlast's ending is almost a textbook example of what can go wrong if a game fails to recognise this. It's almost an insult to those who stuck it out to the end, and it tarnishes the rest of the product by finishing on a sour note, in my opinion. Admittedly, the DLC does go some way towards fixing this and kind of retconning the ending, but you'd have to pay for that separately, which you should do because it's a really good DLC. But that's not the point, and the ending of the main game shouldn't be forgiven. Nevertheless, I would recommend Outlast to those who like their horror brutal, uncompromising, and graphic, just as long as you can handle a few jump scares. Recommendation: one of the most intense horror games on the market, Outlast delivers grisly content at every turn. Rating: 7 out of 10. Also, because I mentioned it a few times, the Whistleblower DLC gets an 8. I actually prefer it. Thank you for listening, and check in soon for part 2 of this series.